HighBridge, a division of recorded books, presents The Silver Ghost by Charlotte Macleod, read by Andi Arndt.
For Julia and all the Daniels. Chapter 1. Professor Ufford favored the loveliest woman at the revel with a condescending smile. "I suppose you subscribe to the popular fallacy that Henry VIII introduced Morris dancing to England." Sarah Kelling Bittersohn shook her head, not only in denial, but also to make sure the underpinnings of her hennin hadn't come loose. "Why should I? Wasn't it John of Gaunt?" Probably." The professor switched off his smile and turned on a supercilious sneer. "The theory that the dance may have been inspired by the Morisco, or Spanish fandango, is of course absurd. My most recently published book offers conclusive arguments for a Flemish origin. Do I gather that you've been reading Terpsichore Totters? Because I happen to know about John of Gaunt?" Now quite sure of her hennin, Sarah tilted back her head to give Professor Ufford the kind of smile her Aunt Emma had been seen to give a guest who slopped red wine on her white damask tablecloth. "Doesn't everyone?" That was nasty. Sarah herself happened to be informed on the subject only because her cousin Lionel had backed her into a corner at Aunt Appy's Easter luncheon and talked about Morris dancing until she could think of a non-violent way to stop him, which was no small task with Lionel. Anyway, she'd managed to stop Professor Ufford. He touched the wide circular brim of his black straw hat and wandered off, perhaps to find another pretty lady who hadn't yet heard about John of Gaunt. Sarah could have told Ufford where he'd got the idea for his costume, too. That hat, with its crown shaped into a truncated cone wrong end up, had appeared in Van Hyde's portrait of Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife. She couldn't think why the professor had chosen a style that suited him so ill. It hadn't suited Arnolfini all that well either. There was some excuse for Arnolfini, since the costume had no doubt been all the rage back in 1432. But why had the professor gone to so much trouble and expense to get himself up like a pregnant giraffe? His long neck and longer, bonier head stuck up in an almost grotesque continuum above the bulky calf-length cloak. Far too much of his stringy shins stuck out below. The green stretch tights he'd pulled over them were a forceful argument for a middle-aged man's keeping his trousers on. Perhaps Sarah simply hadn't yet adjusted to the medieval mystique. This was the first year she and her husband Max had attended the Billingsgates' annual Renaissance revel. Bill and Abigail were close friends of her Uncle Jeremy Kelling. Normally Jem would have been here instead of the Bittersohns. This year, however, Jem was yachting with a different set of cronies. Sarah and Max were here on business, though nobody was supposed to know. The Billingsgates' problem was an unusual one for them to become involved with. Stolen paintings, jewelry, and objets d'art were their specialty. This was the first time they'd ever been asked to track down a missing 1927 new Phantom Rolls Royce. The crux of the matter was that the Phantom shouldn't have vanished at all, considering the lengths to which Bill had gone to keep his precious antique safe. Only somebody closely connected with the family, it seemed, could have got the car away. That was why Nehemiah Billingsgate, to give him his proper name, as almost nobody ever did, had put in a frantic last-minute call to Jem's niece and nephew-in-law instead of to the police. The Renaissance revel had provided a perfect excuse to get the Bittersohns on the scene and introduce them to the family's inner circle, along with a good many circumferentials. As soon as they got a chance, they'd have to get together with their host and employer to sort out who was who. For now, Sarah and Max had set themselves to mingle. Max was taking the assignment as something of a joke so far. He'd insisted on entering this nest of affluent wasps as the Merchant of Venice's business rival. His own academic robe, which he'd bought when he got his Ph.D., and now wore when he had to speak in front of learned gatherings, as he was increasingly asked to do, made an acceptable costume for Shylock. He'd added his father's black yarmulke and suggested carrying a salami to symbolize the contested pound of flesh. Sarah had drawn the line at the salami. "I am not going to the Billingsgates' with a man who smells like a delicatessen. It's unprofessional. Besides, Abigail might think you were afraid she wouldn't give you enough to eat. The contrast between a typical Kelling party spread and the amount of food considered minimal at even the smallest Bittersohn family affair had been a source of wonderment between them ever since they'd met. Max often had to stop for a hamburger upon leaving the former, and Sarah usually went on a 2-day diet after the latter. Even Max's mother, though, couldn't have thought anybody likely to starve at the Billingsgates'. Their house was one of those architectural vagaries that used to be indulged in sometimes during the golden age of cheap labor and no income tax by romantic millionaires with Minivercivi-esque yearnings. Max and Sarah had arrived to find red and yellow pennons flapping from the turrets and a red and white-striped pavilion set up outside the portcullis. Under this vast canopy were long trestle tables already laden with cates and dainties to keep body and soul together until such time as the revelers might get down to serious feeding. Along with the food there were punches and possets, but mostly there was mead. Mead was a big thing at the Billingsgates'. They brewed it in their cellar from honey gathered by Abigail's thousands upon thousands of bees. Most of the potent product was sold to entrepreneurs who ran medieval feasts on a commercial basis, but Abigail and Bill kept their choicest bottlings for themselves and their friends. Today, the bees had all been lured off to distant fields. Abigail was trying to convince her guests that they could go where they chose without running the risk of getting stung. Some were strolling along the nearer garden paths, but few were bothering to risk the Apian Panzer divisions in the back acres. Here by the pavilion, the grass was like plush, and the entertainment was lively enough. A space had been cordoned off with ropes for dancing. Nearby, another miniature pavilion had been set up for the musicians. Lorista, daughter-in-law of the Billingsgates' good friends, the Dorks, and sister to Sarah's aforementioned cousin Lionel's wife, Vera, was in her glory here. She'd left her dulcimer at home, to Sarah's relief, but brought her recorder. Instead of playing the instrument, she was conducting with it, while an assortment of kindred spirits tooted their crumb horns, twanged their lutes, or thumped their tabors. All were in Renaissance garb, loosely speaking. Lorista herself was the most renaissant of the lot, as might have been expected from a woman who hadn't even been able to sing Eensy Meensy Spider to her infant daughter without first getting herself up in 7 petticoats and thick white stockings cross-gartered to the knees. The aim of the consort's amalgamated discords was to provide an accompaniment to a group of men in green hose, scarlet doublets with dagged and slittered edges, and bright yellow liripipe hoods. Each had a string of bells tied garter-like below each knee. At the moment, each was carrying 2 beribboned white batons which he clicked against other men's sticks. The men's movements were precise and spirited. John of Gaunt would have been pleased. As Sarah paused to watch, Max dodged a passing farthingale and came over to join her. "Is that Lionel? I didn't know he danced." "He told me he did, but I hadn't realized he was so good," Sarah replied. "Who are the others, do you know?" "The one beside Lionel must be Dork the Younger," Max said. "He looks just like his father, poor guy. The tall one in the middle's the Billingsgates' son-in-law." "Lucky Melisande. He is good-looking, I must say. You don't suppose his name is Peleus?" "Who knows? His last name's Perbody. He told me to call him Tick when I came out here yesterday. There must be a few Whets and Tolbathies in the bunch. They always hang together. Too bad Jem's on the high seas, or half seas over, more likely. He'd know who's which." "And he'd tell them all what we're here for once he got his nose in the mead," Sarah added. She didn't have to worry about being overheard. The jangling and clacking combined with the twanging and tooting and thumping to produce a fairly high noise level. Whoever the dancers might be, they were taking their fun with the same dogged concentration as the musicians. "They do flutter a lot," she went on. "What do you bet Lorista designed the costumes?" "Stands to reason," Max agreed. "By the way, did you get a chance to call Miriam?" His sister was babysitting the youngest Kelling, since their housekeeper had the day off. "Yes, dear. She says Davy finished his bottle, ate every bite of his carrots, and hasn't cried once since we left. He doesn't miss us a bit." Sarah tried not to sound disappointed, but didn't quite manage. "Ah, he's just putting on a brave front," Max consoled her. "Come on, I'll buy you a sack posset." "Ugh, no thanks. I'd adore a cup of tea, but I suppose it's out of period." Shouldn't we mingle some more? I suppose so. I'll mingle right and you mingle left. That means you get to mingle with your Aunt Appy. Max, you beast! Where is she? I can't see over all those padded headdresses. She's under that big tree, talking with some woman wearing a Queen Mary hat. Good heavens, I'll bet that's Aunt Bodie. I didn't know she was coming. Are you sure my hennon's on straight? Looks perfect to me. You're far and away the best-dressed woman here. Max spoke with only a modicum of prejudice. Considering that Sarah and her sister-in-law had whipped together her costume only the night before, after she'd learned they were expected to show up in medieval dress, Sarah did look totally delightful. She'd constructed her tall conical headdress from a sheet of heavy watercolor paper that she'd painted in a mille fleurs design. A piece of green mosquito netting borrowed from Cousin Brooks, the family naturalist, floated from the tip and could be whisked into use should Abigail's bees decide after all to join in the festivities. Her gown was, in confidence, a pink satin nightie she'd bought for her honeymoon and never been given a chance to wear. Over it she wore a sumptuous pale green hopeland made from a pair of brocaded draperies Miriam had picked up at a yard sale ages ago. The sleeves reached almost to the ground and were a heavy responsibility, as was the short train wagging after her, but the effect was so enchanting that everybody who caught sight of her turned around to look again. As she swept across the close-clipped lawn, Apollonia Kelling hailed her with rapture. "Sarah, how too utterly utter! Isn't she too ravishing for words, Bodie?" "I can't imagine you're ever finding anything for words, Appy." Boadicea Kelling wasn't being consciously rude, merely stating the facts as she saw them. "I dare say you could use that redingote affair for a negligee afterward, Sarah, if you shortened the sleeves and took up the hem. You don't plan to waste so much expensive material, of course." "Why not?" Sarah answered brazenly, glancing back to make sure her train was disposed to best advantage. "One never knows when one might need a hopeland. Besides, my daughter might like to dress up in it some day." "But you don't have a daughter," Boadicea Kelling reminded her. "David Josiah is a boy." "Yes, thank you, I had noticed that. But Max and I are thinking we might try again sometime, now that we've got the knack. How are you, Aunt Bodie?" "Well, as always, thank you. My blood pressure stays at 130/80. I still do my brisk 4-mile walk each day, and my weight hasn't varied by more than 1.5 pounds during the past 36 years. "Ah, but it will have by the time we get up from the banquet," crowed Appy. Boadicea shook her Queen Mary toque. Sarah knew the hat well. When she was a little girl, it had been a rich purple color. Gradually the velvet had changed to a strange bronzy taupe. Now it was almost cream. Boadicea had become too much a Kelling to fuss over trifles like that. "I realize the custom is for guests to gorge themselves to the limit, but I have no intention of doing so. The leftover food won't go to waste. I've already verified that point with Abigail. She and Bill are having their respective Sunday school classes over tomorrow to eat up the perishables and stage their own modest version of a Renaissance revel. This will be an educational experience for the young people. They are expected to improvise their own costumes. Otherwise, you could have left yours for one of them to wear, Sarah." "No, I couldn't. I didn't bring anything else to put on." Her aunt refrained from commenting on Sarah's lack of foresight. Her niece would know better another time, now that she'd been made aware of her shortcoming. Boadicea never nagged. She merely pointed out the proper course of action and assumed thenceforth it would be followed. She had read Norman Vincent Peale's book, The Power of Positive Thinking, as a young woman, and never forgotten its message. She was thus able to find a positive word for Lorista and her consort, even though Lorista had now begun singing a ballad about the rat-catcher's wife and the fiddle-dee-dee. "Such diligence is commendable. I assume the musicians are donating their services." "Bill assures me they're going to stop soon. He's scheduled a program of uninterrupted Renaissance music to be played over his local radio station during the banquet." "Dear me, can one do that?" cried Apollonia. "I must get hold of WCRB about our church bazaar. Bach and Purcell, don't you think?" "Nonsense, Appy." Boadicea spoke crisply because one really had to be crisp with Apollonia Kelling. "Bill can choose his own program for the reason that he owns the station. His object is to allow the listening audience to share our enjoyment of the auditory portion of the revel, thereby furthering the spirit of universal brotherhood to which he and Abigail are so laudably dedicated." "But the audience won't know we're reveling, and they won't get any mead." Appy investigated her own pewter flagon and discovered it to be empty. "I believe I'll wander off and see if I can find a serving wench, or do I mean pot-boy? Shall I get some for you, Bodhi?"
"Thank you, no. I'm fine for the moment. We must concede, Sarah," Boadicea added as the other aunt took herself off wenchward, "that Appy's point is well taken. Some of the experiments Bill performs with those radio stations of his seem to presuppose a higher level of rapport with his public than may, in fact, exist. With regard to the mead, however, delivering their fair share to the listeners would be difficult to achieve, and quite possibly a violation of the alcoholic beverage distribution laws. It's as well Bill abstained from making the attempt. I do hope Appy doesn't break her neck tripping over that skirt." Chapter 2. Most of the revelers had obliged their hosts by showing up in medieval or Renaissance costumes. Sarah wasn't enough of a scholar to sort out which was which, and didn't suppose it mattered. Even experts could be ambiguous as to exactly when the Middle Ages left off and the rebirth of culture began. A few seemed to be of the opinion that the Renaissance was still going on. This left plenty of latitude for choice, and the guests had used it all. Some would have simply rented appropriate garb for the day. Others, like Professor Ufford, must have had authentic costumes made to order at no small expense. Spectacular outfits such as his had probably been gracing the Billingsgates' revels already for some years, and would no doubt appear again and again, so the expense would be amortized over a long period. Then there were those who'd chosen to improvise, of whom Apollonia Kelling was definitely one. Sarah realized that her aunt's costume must be based on the evening gown Appy used to wear on opening nights at the Huntington Avenue Opera House. Sarah only knew about these openings from hearsay, the opera house having been torn down shortly before she herself was born, but she had seen clippings in Uncle Jem's scrapbook. This was the gown that had strained the society editor's ingenuity to the point of cracking. One year Mrs. Samuel Kelling would be reported as having appeared in kingfisher blue, the next year in teal blue, the following year cobalt blue, then on to cerulean blue, azure blue, bluebonnet blue, forget-me-not blue, and finally back to kingfisher. By now the gown was a decidedly faded blue, but Appy had cheered it up with a screaming orange overblouse, probably borrowed from her daughter-in-law, and a good many strings of beads relatives had brought her from time to time as souvenirs of places they'd visited. Chains of polished quahog shells from Maine joggled together with seed pods from Papua and fake scarabs from Cairo, perhaps symbolizing the far-flung explorations carried out during the Renaissance. For a headdress, Appy had simply pinned the open end of a white linen pillowcase around her head like a coif, and let the rest of the case flop down her back. It was rather flapping than flopping just now, as a brisk wind had sprung up. On Appy's tall, gaunt figure the effect was that of laundry blowing around a clothes pole. Boadicea gazed after her cousin, interested but not censorious. "Appy is enjoying herself. I myself saw no reason to bother about a costume. The dress I have on is middle-aged enough as it is, and so am I. Have you seen Drusilla Gaheris around anywhere, Sarah?"
"I'm afraid I shouldn't know her if I did."
"Not unless you were introduced today. There was that possibility. Drusilla is almost certainly here since she's Abigail's house guest. I do realize, however, that you and Mr. Bittersohn—"
"Do call him Max."
"Very well, if you wish me to," Boadicea conceded. "That you and Max, as I was about to say, had not been acquainted with the Billingsgates and their circle before that unfortunate business with Wouter Tolbathy. I grant you Wouter was always an odd duck, but so many inventors are, don't you think? Too bad he was never able to adapt his undoubted genius to any useful purpose. Ah, here comes Drusilla now, with Hester Tolbathy."
"Oh, good," said Sarah. "I do like Hester so much."
"It's quite likely you'll enjoy Drusilla, too."
Sarah thought it possible. Mrs. Gaheris looked sensible enough, anyway, in a drab-colored costume with a lighter coif. Sarah thought at first Aunt Bodie's friend had come as a nun. Then she remembered the habits worn by religious orders until recent years were in fact survivals of middle-class 16th-century housewives' daily garb. Hester, on the other hand, had flung herself headlong into the festival spirit. Her gown was of purple satin over a wide-spreading farthingale, with a gold-embroidered stomacher and a stiffened lace collar that must have been hell to wear. Her abundant white hair was dressed high with artificial roses and a chain of real amethysts. Rings flashed on thumbs and finger joints as she held out both hands to Sarah.
"The little mother! How lovely you look, Sarah dear! Did you bring your baby with you?"
"No, Davy's not quite ready for grown-up parties yet. He's back at Ireson's Landing with his aunt and his grandma."
"Being gloriously spoiled, no doubt. But he's thriving?"
"He was fine the last I heard."
"Which was?"
"About 15 minutes ago," Sarah confessed. "Max teases me about being over-anxious, but if I don't keep checking, he reminds me."
"That wears off after the first one," Hester assured her. "And you really like living year-round at Ireson's Landing? You don't miss Boston at all?"
"Not a bit. We love our new house, and it's marvelous being so close to the ocean and to Max's family. He grew up on the North Shore, you know, and I've spent so many summers there that we felt at home from the very first day. Anyway, we do still have the Beacon Hill house. My cousin Brooks and his wife live there, but we keep a couple of rooms upstairs for ourselves to use whenever we decide to stay in town."
"That sounds like an ideal arrangement. Bodie, how good to see you! Did you drive all the way from Wenham by yourself? Drusilla Gaheris, do you know Bodie's niece, Sarah Bittersohn? She was Walter Kelling's daughter."
"Then you must be Lionel's cousin," said Mrs. Gaheris. "How do you do, Sarah? Lionel married my niece Verene."
"Oh, Vera, of course. She mentioned an aunt who lived abroad."
"Yes, my husband was with the State Department. He died in Switzerland this past year, and I decided I didn't want to stay over there by myself. I must say it's lovely to be among my own connections again, and to be meeting so many new ones. I missed both Vera's and Lorista's weddings, along with far too many other family functions, though I'd known both Lionel and Dorky as little boys. They're quite good, don't you think?" The Morris dancers were still leaping and kicking, still in perfect unison, still with no sign of flagging. With their ribbons and bells they made a merry sight to watch, even though their faces were grim enough. Like true Yankees, they were determined to have a good time if it killed them all. Even the wheezings and creakings of Lorista's consort didn't sound too bad in the open air. Village bands of the 16th and 17th centuries probably wouldn't have been any better, Sarah told herself. Soon, though, Lorista raised her recorder high and brought it down with a savage slash, narrowly missing the cor anglais. Music and dancers came smartly to a halt. Onlookers clapped. Potboys bustled up with fistfuls of flagons. Lionel stuck his batons into the belt of his doublet and walked over to where the four women were standing. "Well, Aunt Bodie, Aunt Drusilla, good to see you, Mrs. Tolbathy. Where's Max, Sarah?"
"Around somewhere."
Seen Mother?"
"Appy was with us a little while ago," said Boadicea. "I believe she may have gone into the pavilion. Allow me to compliment you on your dancing, Lionel. The Morris dance is of ancient origin, is it not?"
"That depends on what you call ancient," was his gracious reply.
"I call myself ancient," said Hester Tolbathy, "and my feet are going to start aching in about 1 minute if I don't find a place to sit down."
"What about that bench under the tree?" Sarah suggested.
"It looks as if the birds have been there first," Mrs. Gaheris objected. "Isn't there some place cleaner and softer?"
"We could go into the pavilion," said Hester.
"Or up to the car shed," said Boadicea. "I must confess that when the reveling gets a bit too much for me, I always slip off and sit in one of Bill's Rolls Royces."
Drusilla Gaheris raised her eyebrows as far as her starched coif would allow.
"I know Abigail and Bill each drive a Rolls. Don't tell me there are more." "9 in all, I believe."
"No, 10, Hester Tolbathy corrected. "Bill gave Abigail a 1927 Silver Cloud for Christmas this past year. They're all antiques, Drusilla. Heaven only knows what they're worth by now." "Oh, but we mustn't give Drusilla the idea Bill simply went out and squandered a lot of money on them," cried Boadicea. "How it started, Drusilla, was that Bill's grandfather bought one of the early models in 1908, I believe it was. Then, of course, the cars kept getting better, so he bought another in 1916. Then Bill's father was given one for his graduation from Harvard in 1924, and his sister Eglantine got hers as a wedding present. And then the Depression came along, and people were selling off their Rollses for whatever they could get," Hester went on. "So the Billingsgates picked up a couple more for Bill and his brother Ralph to drive when they got old enough. Naturally, one doesn't trundle a Rolls off to the junkyard, and I suppose it seemed rather vulgar to turn them in, so they simply accumulated. After a while, the Rollses became something of a family joke. Bill's parents gave him and Abigail a 1945 Sedanka DeVille to go honeymooning in, and so it went. It's got so that whenever Bill sees an old Rolls going at a bargain, he just buys the car and stuffs it in with the rest of them." "What a fascinating hobby," said Mrs. Gaheris. "Do they all work?" "Oh, yes," Hester assured her. "I'm sure you'll be dragged off to a rally as soon as we've recovered from the revel. We go in a bunch. Tom and I and the Dorks and the Wets and our various offspring and their wives, or husbands, as the case may be, and Bill and Abigail, needless to say. I expect you'll get to drive the new Phantom." "Me? I'd be scared to touch it." "When were you ever scared of anything? Remember how we used to pile into that Chevy Roadster of yours with the rumble seat and go whooping around like a pack of Zelda Fitzgeralds? Ah, those were the days, and aren't you glad we don't have to live them over? Come on, Drusilla, let's go see the cars." But they couldn't. Sarah wondered whether or not she should be the one to break the news that the car shed had been declared out of bounds for the day. She didn't particularly mind sending Aunt Bodie on a wild goose chase, but it did seem a shame for Hester Tolbathy to drag her farthingale all the way up there for nothing. Luckily, the matter was taken out of her hands. Two of the musicians, now carrying brass trumpets fully a yard long and wearing tabards emblazoned with what was presumably the Billingsgate coat of arms, a bee volant on a field semé, marched to the front of the pavilion and began creating a terrible din. The banquet was announced. And a banquet, in sooth, it was. Renaissance revelers had evidently been hearty feeders, when they got the chance, and the Billingsgates weren't about to dishonor the tradition. Even Max was impressed. "My God, this looks like a Newton bar mitzvah. What is all that stuff, anyway?" There'd been some fudging of recipes to suit modern tastes, and a few pardonable subterfuges. The peacock pies, for instance, were only turkey under borrowed plumage, and the swans but geese. The baron of beef, the larded capons, and the salads of herbs were authentic as could be. So, no doubt, was the huge silver bowl full of something gruelish that sat square in the middle of the laden trestle. Even Sarah couldn't guess what it might be. "Frumenty," said Marcia Wet, who happened to be standing beside them. "Just whole wheat boiled in milk and spices, actually. Abigail always sets it out because she feels it's the thing to do, but she doesn't really expect us to eat any. Take half a spoonful for manners and leave it on your plate, that's what I always do." As she spoke, Marcia gave herself a generous helping without seeming to notice she was doing so. Max decided to pass up the frumenty, then shrugged and helped both himself and Sarah to a dollop. Es, mein Kind. It's probably good for you." "It must have some redeeming feature. Enjoy your dinner, dear. I'm going to mingle some more." Sarah took her plate over to one of the long tables and sat down. There was no printed menu. She supposed not all the lords or ladies of the period would have been able to read one. At least everybody got his own knife and fork, although it appeared the forks were anachronistic. The gentry hadn't started introducing them to their tables until sometime in the 17th century, and even then many considered them a silly affectation. She knew all this because Professor Ufford told her so. She'd picked a seat next to old Tom Tolbathy, whom she liked very much, assuming she'd be able to have a comfortable chat with him about who was who and why. Tom would have been only too glad to oblige, but Ufford had zeroed in on the empty seat at her right. Since then, neither of them had been able to get a word in edgewise. Her neighbors across the table, Buck Tolbathy and young Dork,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?